Alrighty, welcome in everyone to another edition of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is July 2nd around here, It is July 2nd. We are 53 days from college football kicking off, and we got a couple of things to get into today. Apologies for a little bit of the absence, dealing with some personal stuff, but we won't waste too much time on that because we got plenty of other things to talk about. We'll do a little bit of kind of a catch-up show. A lot of stuff has happened since the last time that we have talked. Definitely want to get you guys updated on all of the different happenings from around college football, and then starting on Monday, we're going to get really into the weeds. We're going to start getting into talking about this upcoming season, sleepers, players to watch, transfers that were huge for their teams or will be huge for their teams in this upcoming season, and about a million other things. So we got a lot of stuff coming down the pipe here pretty soon, but did want to give you guys a little bit of an update of where we are right now, how we're moving into July and moving into this 2025 season. And the biggest thing is the House settlement has officially passed. That is the biggest news that we have found over the last little bit in sports. Frankly, the biggest news in college sports in a really long time. It totally changes the way that athletes are going to get paid, totally changes the way that recruiting is going to work, and that's something we'll talk about here in a second, but it's a huge step in the right direction. A lot of different things have to go correctly, and another thing that we'll talk about here in a second, but the reality is this is a big time step forward for college sports in general. We'll just have to see how it all kind of comes into play this year. But let's get some basic facts out of the way. Then we'll talk about kind of the effect on recruiting and NIL and how that all that works. And then we'll kind of talk about just is this going to work? Is this going to be something that is going to be able to be enforceable at the way that they want it to? That's kind of still up for debate, and we'll figure that out over the next year or so. But at the end of the day, let's start with some basic facts, some basic details of what is going on. And if you've kind of had your head in the sand for the last little bit, no big deal. We got a ton of stuff coming down the pipe for you. That should be $2.8 billion, but $2.8 billion will be paid to former athletes that did not get to partake in NIL. So that's kind of where this all started. It was a couple of former athletes that claimed, we could have made X amount of dollars if we had the ability to participate in NIL the way kids are today, and they weren't given that opportunity. So they want a little bit of the back pay, and that's something that is going to kind of come to fruition over the next, I believe, 10 years is when that payout's going to happen. The reality is there's not much to worry about if you're a college football fan with that. That's just kind of something that's going to be happening kind of in the periphery, not super important to what's going on in the world of college sports today. What is important is the $20.5 million that can be distributed to current athletes. And we'll talk about a lot of the money that has already been spent in that regard, because a lot of NIL deals went out this past month just to get in right under the nose of a lot of this NIL go and a lot of the different, College Sports Commission, that thing down there. All the NIL deals that are over $600 will have to be cleared by a clearinghouse that is run by Deloitte. It is a lot of different things, but essentially just confirming that the deal meets the fair market value. If it's not enough, if it's too much for what you're doing, that will obviously be kind of where they step in. Will be an interesting thing to watch. There's no doubt about that. What Brooks Austin calls the head fed over there is going to be someone that we're going to hear a lot about, and people probably aren't going to like too much. There's going to be a lot of back and forth, a lot of confusion, but in terms of that $20.5 million that is being distributed to current athletes all over the country, the likely split as of right now, and there's been a couple of different ideas. I know Alabama had a very interesting idea that might push a little bit more towards the non-revenue making sports, but as of right now, it seems about 75% of that money, so about $15 million, is going to find its way to football, 15% to men's basketball, 5% to women's basketball, and then 5% to kind of be split among the rest of the sports. Obviously, the non-revenue making sports were going to be the ones that got hit the hardest, especially when Title IX was decided it's not a huge deal in this scenario. That's still kind of being litigated right now, so that's something to watch. But overall, this is something that I think all of us kind of expected, especially if Title IX was not going to be involved. It was going to be really hard to keep that money away from football. So a lot of it will go towards football, but everyone is getting a little bit of a pay bump overall, and that will be a great thing for college sports. Just got to make sure it doesn't become so much of a return on investment type approach that you start cutting the sports that aren't quite giving you what you gave them from this kind of settlement. So that's something to watch. That's something that obviously will kind of take shape over the next 18 months, and we'll see if that really does come to fruition the way that we're all expecting it. If, a couple of sports get cut off in the next couple of years, a lot of that stuff will kind of be decided behind closed doors, but it does feel like there's quite a bit of push to make sure that there is enough money going to the non-revenue sharing sports. But in terms of college football, there are scholarship limits, or excuse me, scholarship limits have been eliminated officially, but there are roster limits now. And for college football, it's 105. It sounds like these are going to kind of get phased in over the next couple of years, so it's not like 20 guys at every single college football program around the country are now looking for a spot to play sports or even to go to school. At the end of the day, it's going to take a couple of years to get to that 105 number, but that's where we're getting. And you'll probably find that pretty much every one of those 105 players are on scholarship. That's just kind of gonna kind of be the way it goes. Hopefully that kind of spills over into other sports. You see all the baseball team have scholarships instead of 11.7, I believe was the number around baseball the last little bit. So a lot of different moving parts around this. Obviously it'll affect other sports a little bit more than college football in some respects, but there's quite a big effect here, and there's definitely some big things to watch for. The biggest thing that I've noticed, even over the last 2 weeks, and even over the last week or so, is the effect on the recruiting. Recruiting trail has been really busy the last little bit, and we'll get into that a little bit more detail on Monday. Georgia's doing just despicable things to every other team in the country right about now on the recruiting trail, but at the end of the day, recruiting will not be defined as much by NIL. I want it to be very, very clear when I say as much, because the reality is there will still be those guys. There will still be guys that are saying, I want to make as much money as I possibly can. I want to make money and be starting. There will always be those guys. We're never going to get out of those guys. There were guys before NIL that had that approach to college football, but we're going to get back to kind of relationships and development and the place mattering a lot more, and you've already kind of seen it take place over the last couple of weeks, particularly when you talk about the NIL side of things. Now, the big thing to keep in mind here is all of these rules just went into place yesterday, I believe, so everything is finally getting checked by NIL Go, by the College Sports Commission going forward. There was a lot of NIL money handed out during the month of June. I believe the number was 824% more was given out this June compared to last June. So everyone's trying to get their money in when they can. When it's unregulated, when it is the Wild West, they want to make sure they pay out that money. Now, could cause some problems on the back end because you have a lot of money tied up with these players right now. How do you handle that when new players try to come in the door and you have to pay them? I think that's something that a couple of people are struggling from, particularly Ohio State right about now. Just feels like there's quite a bit of money tied up with Caleb Downs, tied up with Jeremiah Smith, tied up with these really elite players that you're more than happy to give the money to, but it might be hurting them on the recruiting trail just a little bit right now. That is something to watch over the next little bit. It'll all work out for Ohio State. I promise Ohio State will not have a problem here, but the reality is there's a little bit of a tiptoeing going on between teams and general managers and everything just to make the money work, because it is little bit all over the place right about now. But recruiting's going to sort of at least inch towards what we used to have, which was a relationship development-based recruitment that wasn't defined by who's the highest bidder. That happened a lot over the NIL era, and it was something that was really exhausting for a lot of people and something that took people totally out of recruiting. Even when you signed the paper, it didn't feel like you were fully a part of the team until I saw you on that field. And then at the end of the year, you're holding your breath once again because transfer portal has come into play and people will contact you even before that came into play. And that's something actually we'll get into at the very end of the show. But the reality is, this will make this more about relationships, development, and less about the dollar amount. Because the reality is, you can't have a team offering $1 million and then another team offering $4 million. Because the team offering $4 million has to make it all work for the rest of the guys as well. And it's not just the Wild West where you can throw money and say, he's going to go here for an hour on Tuesday, and I'm going to give him $100,000. That's not going to work anymore. So a lot of different things have happened over the last couple of weeks, and we really will see the kind of the impacts over the next 18, 24 months, where we really see how intense of a change this is. Is it really still just a bidding war, or are we kind of going back to the way recruiting was, which is the way I wanted, is the way that I think a lot of people want? It was something that Josh Pate talked about on his show. Just has a different feel about recruiting this time around than it has the last couple of years, and I love it. Recruiting is so much fun to me. I was still very much into it during the NIL era, but I fully understood where people were coming from when they said, is this really something that we want? Is this something that is going to, work out in the long term? It definitely wasn't. We finally have that kind of out of the way, and we're able to move forward with hopefully the recruiting that we all love, and the recruiting that got us very excited every single summer, every single winter when you're going into National Signing Day. That's kind of what I want, and just feels like we're going to find our way back to that with this new revenue structure. Obviously, there will still be those outliers, but feels like recruiting is finding its way back to what recruiting should be, which is development, relationships, and not so much the bidding war that has been the last couple of years. But the other part of this is this enforceable? That's probably the biggest part of this, if we're being totally honest. You can pass all the rules you want. You can put in the head fed, as they're calling him over there in the Phil Guy Network. You can do all of that stuff, and it can be all look really, really good from the outside looking in. Do you have the ability under law to enforce these rules? Because that's been the hurdle for about every single the last 3 years. It's been a huge, huge hurdle to figure out. Our NIL rules are one thing, but then state rules are another thing, and then federal laws are an entirely different thing. It is a very, very tough thing to figure out. Now, it feels like most teams are, I don't want to say rolling over, but falling in line, let's say. It seems like most teams understand that these rules are going to be in place going forward, and they're trying to get everything kind of in check. I know Georgia's doing that right now. I know a number of other teams are just trying to kind of play within the boundaries, because if you play within the boundaries now, you don't have a problem in 2 years when these rules are actually enforceable, and then they can come back and kind of get you on stuff that you did now. So it feels like most people are falling in line. That being said, why I have Tennessee up there, they're not necessarily causing a huge stink, but Tennessee state laws are kind of the big time thing here, and the thing that was talked about most readily when the House settlement was officially passed was Tennessee state laws are a little bit more lenient. They're a little bit more, do what you need to do, shift money around. The government's not allowed to look at, that market value and decide whether or not it's fair for what you got. That wasn't really in place, or isn't really in place in the state of Tennessee. Will the College Sports Commission kind of supersede that? Can they supersede that if the government does not get fully involved? Now, they're involved, here and there, but if the government does not give them the antitrust exemption, is this all in place the way that it needs to? Is this enforceable in the way that it needs to be? Or is it still kind of the Wild West with just a little bit of a facade that looks a little bit nicer? Is it a really nice looking house from the outside, and then you walk in and it's been just torn to pieces? That's the question that you have to answer over the next little bit, and it's not going to be an easy one to answer. We're going to find out probably over some lawsuits. We're going to find out over some messy things, but at the end of the day, I think the biggest thing to keep in mind here is this sport has been broken. There's no two ways about that. I think everyone understands that this sport has not been operating the way that it should, or the way that is healthiest for the fans, for the players, for the coaches, for the sport as a whole. It has not been operating the way that I don't think any of us want it to be operating the way it has the last couple of years. So we're taking a step in the right direction. We have built the foundation of the house, and now we got to build the rest of it. We got to make sure that all the rooms are in place. We got to make sure that there's no mistakes. We got to make sure there's no loopholes. There's no holes in the wall. There's nothing that can go wrong with this, because the reality is this is a massive step in the right direction. If you didn't like all of the NIL payments and the bidding wars that happened in recruiting, you should be very happy about this. If you don't want college football players to get paid at all, you might want to find a new sport, because the reality is they are going to get paid. They're going to get paid quite a bit of money, frankly, because they bring in quite a bit of money to those schools. So this will be a battle back and forth. There's still a lot of stuff that has to happen for this to be enforceable, for this to be put in the place that we all want it to be. But the reality is, this is one of the bigger things that has happened in college sports in the last 80 years, if I'm being totally honest, since they've signed those media deals for college football, for college sports overall. This is probably one of the bigger moves in the entirety of college sports history. We just got to hope that it works out the right way. And there's a lot of different people that you have to rely on to make that happen. There's a lot of different people that are going to have to do their jobs very effectively. And we'll see what happens over the next little bit. We'll see if Brian Seeley gets a little bit too many lawsuits on his desk, if, these aren't enforceable laws. All of that will kind of come into play over the next little bit. But as of right now, feels like everyone's fallen into place, and it feels like this sport is inching its way back to being the sport that we kind of all love, and being the sport that is played on the field and not talked about endlessly talked about NIL and all of the different stuff off the field. So we're getting back there. We're finding our way back. It's not going to be perfect right away. It's going to take some time, but it really does feel like everyone's on board for this. Feels like it's the best thing for everyone involved, and we just got to hope that we stick the landing here. That's going to be a really interesting thing to watch, but let's take a little bit of a break here. When we come back, we got to talk about the CFP changes because there's a lot of different stuff going on for 2025 and then beyond is the real debate that's going on, but we'll give you all the updates that you need to know right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the House settlement. Going to be really interesting to watch. A huge move in the world of college football, the world of college sports as a whole. A lot of things could go wrong with this. A lot of things could go incredibly right, and we could have a sport that we feel good about. Now, conference realignment is going to be a totally different thing that hopefully we can fix at some point, and actually we'll get into that here in a little bit in the next segment. But at the end of the day, a huge step forward for college sports, and now we move forward. We got to see what we have next, and one of the big things that we're going to have next is CFP. It is going to be changing after this year. How is it going to be changing is the big time question that's going up in the air. Now, I did want to get something before. In 2025, this upcoming year, something has already changed with the 12-team playoff. The thing that I think a lot of us expected to change. They are going to go to straight seeding. They are not going to give the 4 top spots to just the 4 top conference champions. They will go to the 4 top teams in the country. So this past year, it would have been Ohio State, Georgia, Texas, and Penn State instead of Ohio State, Georgia, Arizona State, and Boise State. That's obviously something that kind of lended it to none of the teams that got the bye ended up winning. SMU and Boise State Boise State and Arizona State not quite being on the level of a Texas or a Penn State definitely played into that quite a bit. So this feels like it's going to make things a little bit more even. Feels like it's going to show us, is the bye really a disadvantage, or was it just kind of the circumstances of last year where you have an Ohio State team that's terrifying, that tears through Oregon. You have a Georgia team that just lost Carson Beck. Not why they lost that game, but did lose Carson Beck going into that huge game against the Sugar Bowl against Notre Dame. Notre Dame was playing great football. There's a lot of different things that take into play. I think it's a great idea. Was not a huge fan of the top 4 conference champions getting those top 4 spots, but everything else is the same. The top 5 conference champions will get into the dance. They will just be wherever they're ranked. Like Clemson was last year. They were ranked number 16th in the country, but they got in as a conference champion at number 12. That will just happen kind of across the board. So Boise State, I believe, would have been the 9 seed and played Indiana, if I'm not mistaken. Arizona State would have gotten Ohio State, I believe. They would have been the 11 and would have gotten Ohio State. So it would have been a very different tournament, and we would have seen a different Final Four, probably with Oregon in it, probably with Georgia in it. So a lot of different things that would have happened there. But at the end of the day, we are moving forward with straight seeding, and I can't wait to see what happens going forward because I think it's the step in the right direction. The reality is, though, I think as we all understand at this point, it's not going to stop there. We got a million other things to figure out as we get closer to 2026, and the biggest thing is how many teams are going to be in this thing. It feels like it's going to be 16. It very much feels like it's going to be 16. The reality is, if you ask these TV executives, you ask these commissioners, if you ask the coaches or the players, they want chances. They want chances to get in. The commissioners and the TV deals want inventory. They want more and more games, more and more things to broadcast, and 16 would give you that. So I don't think they're going to go to 14. Maybe if there's an absolute stalemate and they just have to come to something for 2026, maybe they land on that, but I think it'd be more likely that they stick with 12 for 2026 and then renegotiate again. The reality is I think we're going to 16 teams. So just to make everything a little bit easier, let's say we're going to 16 teams and let's roll with that theory. If that's the case, we got about 2 different options, and 2 options that the power conference commissioners at the very least are starting to rally around. And the first one is what I'm going to call the at-large model. It does have auto bids in it, as the auto bid model has a couple of at-larges in it, but for the majority, the at-large model is going to be 5 auto bids as we have it right now, the 5 top conference champions, and then 11 at-large bids. And that is the committee. That is the committee deciding who are the 11 teams. Probably would be straight seeding as, it's going to be going forward. So probably wouldn't have to worry about the top 5 teams being the 5 conference champions. But overall, would be 5 auto bids, 11 at-large bids from anywhere. And that is both a very good idea on face value and has some warts. And I'll get into what I think is the better model here in a second. And then the auto bid model. The auto bid model is one that is getting a little bit of traction, especially in Big Ten country. And it's essentially you'll get 4 auto bids from the Big Ten and the SEC. You'll get 2 from the ACC and, the Big 12, not the SEC. The ACC and the Big 12. You'll get 1 from the group of 5, and then you have 3 at-large bids to kind of fill out the rest of the way. So whether that's a Notre Dame or maybe the runner or the 5th team from the Big 10 or the 5th team from the SEC, whatever that looks like. Not exactly sure, but at the end of the day, that would be the breakdown. You'd have 13 auto bids in that scenario where you'd only have 5. In the at-large model, you'd have 11 at-large bids, and you'd only have 3 in the auto bid model. So a little bit of a back and forth there. The big thing to keep in mind here, and I'm going to focus in on the auto bid model here for a second, is it would transform conference championship weekend. It would totally change it in a number of different ways, and I'm kind of on the fence about this one. I don't know if I like the changes or I hate the changes, but this is kind of the idea of what it would look like in the auto bid model. In the auto bid model, the Big Ten and the SEC, they're getting 4 teams in regardless. So the question is, how do you decide those 4 teams? Is it 1 and 2 get automatic auto bids and maybe they play out a conference championship game, but how do you add importance to that conference championship game is very much up for debate right about now. So maybe it's just 1 and 2 automatically move in, and then you play a 3 versus 6 and a 4 versus 5 for those final 2 spots, and the other team is officially out of it. In the ACC and the Big 12, there are a couple of different options. You could go 1 versus 4 and 2 versus 3 for those 2 spots, or you could say the number 1 team throughout the regular season, you're automatically in. So would have been SMU this last year. I believe it would have been SMU. That last couple of weeks in the ACC was absolutely insane. But at the end of the day, that number 1 team would go ahead and move on in, and 2 and 3 could play for that final spot. So that's kind of an interesting thing to watch. In the Big 12, it would have been, I believe, Arizona State at the end of the day was the number 1 team. Iowa State might have been going into that game, but regardless, at the end of the day, the number 1 team would automatically get in, 2 versus 3 for that final spot. I think this would be very interesting. I think it would give a really interesting conference championship. Now, I don't want to lose conference championship games, and I want them to still matter. I'm having a hard time figuring out how they're going to matter in this format. I'm having a hard time figuring out how we're not just going to reward the regular season champ and say, we'll fight it out the rest of the way to see who goes to the playoff. That's something to figure out. And definitely kind of my biggest reservation when we talk about the auto bid format is just doesn't feel right not having a conference championship, and if you do, not having one that really matters all that much. Now, some people have thrown out the idea of 14 teams. I know Josh Pate threw this idea out where the Big Ten and the SEC champion, they're likely to get those 2 buys. Maybe that's enough to keep that game around. Maybe that's enough to make that interesting. I don't know. It'll be a really interesting thing to watch. Now, it's going to be really hard to convince ESPN and Fox to not be broadcasting those games because they're big-time moneymakers. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch. Maybe we just play a conference championship game just to play it for seeding. Maybe we end up getting rid of it and adding in these play-in games. You never really know. It's going to be really interesting. I want to keep the conference championship game, but really hard for me to picture a way to do that while keeping the importance on it as well. And that's kind of the big thing for me. So we'll see how that kind of develops. That is the big time thing with the auto bid format is you're going to be changing the conference championship week quite a bit. I can almost promise you that. And it might take a couple of these different kind of formats. And we'll see if it works out the way that we want it to. But overall, it'll be a really interesting thing to watch. That is kind of the big time pitch for that auto bid model. The question is, what do the people want? What do these 2 conferences or these 4 conferences, what do they actually want right now? Because they're a little bit split, funnily enough, and actually there's only one standing alone on the auto bid side, and that is the Big Ten. It sounds like the SEC, the ACC, and the Big 12 are all firmly in favor of the 5+11 format, and it's really interesting because I think a lot of these people have a very, very good reason to be standing where they're standing. And I think the ACC and the Big 12 is the most obvious of these answers. The reason that they want the 5 plus 11 is plainly just because the only way they can go back to their fans, they can go back to their presidents, and they can go back to their ADs and say, we are still a top tier conference is if they don't give the other conferences more auto bids. If you give the SEC and give the Big Ten 4 auto bids while saying we'll take 2, no problem, you're admitting you're a second tier conference. The ACC and the Big 12 are not willing, nor should they be willing, to admit that to the world. So they're not going to do that. They do not want to admit that they are a second tier conference, and then you'll see what happens after that, because that could get very messy very quickly. So they're fighting for the 5 plus 11 kind of in spite of what will be good for the ACC and the Big 12, because you'd get more teams in with the auto bid format. I can almost promise you that. The reality is we all understand that a lot of those at-large bids are going to go to the SEC. They're going to go to the Big 10 in that 5 plus 11 format. The ACC and the Big 12 just can't go back to their presidents and say, yeah, we just kind of relegated ourselves to a second-tier conference. That cannot happen, and it wouldn't go over well if you tried to do that. So Jim Phillips, they're not doing that. Brett Yormark over there in the Big 12 is not going to do that. And then you get over to the SEC. Why would the SEC be in favor of the 5 plus 11? Why wouldn't you want 4 auto bids for your conference every single year? Let's be totally honest. The SEC is going to get 4 teams into a 16-team playoff regardless of what the format is. Frankly, they might get 5, they might get 6. There is a lot of SEC teams. I mean, this past year, you would have seen 6 teams in that thing. You would have seen Ole Miss, you would have seen Alabama, you would have seen South Carolina all make the field in a 16-team playoff. That would have made a lot of people really mad. Let's just be totally honest. But the reality is that's what would have happened. The SEC feels totally fine knowing that these at-large bids, they're going to lean their direction because the strength of schedule is going to lean towards the SEC, even if you redo it, which I'm big time in favor of, trying to rework that, trying to, take into account what's happening in the world of college football right now. The reality is it's going to come out in the SEC's favor. Let's just be totally honest. The SEC is going to win the strength of schedule battle every single time against just about every single other conference. So they're going to be fine with 5 plus 11 because it makes them look like a benevolent overlord of the sport while still being able to get a ton of teams in every single year and dominating the conversation when it comes to the playoff. The Big Ten's on the other side of that, and it's a very interesting thing to kind of watch because the Big Ten's going to get plenty of auto bids, or plenty of bids, regardless of the format, whether it's the 5 plus 11 or the auto bid format where they get 4 automatically and maybe add in 1 more in those 3 at-large bids. But the reality is they all saw a 9-3 Alabama, a 9-3 South Carolina, a 9-3 Ole Miss be 10 spots above their 9-3 Illinois at the end of last year. They know that in the game of strength of schedule, in the game of auto bids, in the game of a committee kind of deciding the playoff field, the Big Ten's not going to win that battle. I can almost promise you that. And we saw that bear out last year. An Illinois team that would go on to beat South Carolina actually was way below South Carolina and wouldn't have made the playoff, and South Carolina would have in a 16-team playoff. That's why the Big Ten wants the auto bid model. They understand that in the strength of schedule battle, they're not going to beat out the SEC, and that's who they want to beat out, or at least be on the same exact level of, and that's something that, at least in the auto bid format, you can confirm that you are on the exact same level. In the at-large format, you're kind of just hoping that people see your strength of schedule the same way they see the SEC, and I think we've all proven that's not really the case in the last couple of years. So that's something to watch. I think all of them have a good argument for why they believe the way that they believe. I think both sides are... I don't love expanding the playoff. If I'm being totally honest, I would love for this thing to be 6 teams. If I'm being totally honest, we're not going backwards though. So I'm always working under the assumption of we are going to 16 teams. I think both have a relatively good argument. I'll be totally honest with you, but my overall take is one that I did not think was going to be my take about a year ago. I'm fully in favor of the auto bid system. I think it makes the most sense. I think it really helps conference races be conference races deep into the season, even when you are in Alabama. Or a better example, let's say an Ole Miss. You're going into Gainesville late in the season in a game that was very important for them at the end of the day regardless. But if they were to lose that game, maybe you fall out of the top 6. Maybe you don't even get a chance to play for a spot in the CFP because you let up in one single game. In fact, that would have happened with Ohio State this past year. They were on their way to Indianapolis. They were pretty much packed their bags. They had made their reservations. They were set to go to Indianapolis and face off against Oregon again. Then you lose to Michigan. And you would have been in a position where you got to play in Iowa. You got to play in Indiana to get into the CFP. Now, they probably would have won that game. Let's just be totally honest. But at the end of the day, it would have added a lot of onus on Ohio State to win that Michigan game, to make sure that they didn't let a couple of those opportunities go by the wayside, because then you're going to have to play a whole other game, and then you're going to have to turn around probably the next week or a week or so later and play a CFP game. So there's a lot of different things that could have gone wrong for an Ohio State last season or for a Miami this season. You know, they were firmly in the race. They could have fallen all the way out to not even a playing game, but behind a playing game, depending on what happened around them in the ACC that final weekend. So there's a lot of different stuff going on here, but the reality is, in the auto bid system, a conference race is never done. There is never a moment where a Texas, let's say they're 11-0 going into that Texas A&M game. They can't take their foot off the gas, because if you have another team that is 10-1 going into that final weekend, you have two teams that are 10-1, you could find yourself into the play-in weekend very quickly. You're no longer just playing for seeding, you're not playing for your life, and you have to make sure that you win that final game, or you're in a position where you're in a do-or-die game against a really good team. Let's just be totally honest, especially the way the SEC played out last year. I don't think anyone would have felt very confident picking a 3 versus 6, which I believe would have been Tennessee against South Carolina. And then the other one would have been Alabama against Ole Miss. I wouldn't pick either of those. Both of those games would have been incredible games that would have been very, very tough to pick. And I think they would have been really fun to watch. And in the ACC, you would have had Miami and SMU facing off at the end of the year, maybe Clemson and Miami. Not really sure how that ended. Oh, wait, it would have been Clemson-Miami, excuse me. Clemson-Miami facing off at the very end of the year to get into the CFP. And one of them would have been out, one of them would have been in, but it would have been a really interesting thing to watch. Now, the 1 versus 4, 2 versus 3 for the ACC and Big 12 could happen. I tend to believe it would be the regular season champ is automatically in, and 2 plays 3 for that final spot. But at the end of the day, in terms of what I think, I have a couple of things that I want from the CFP going forward, because I'm not going to get the amount of teams that I want. I'm probably not even going to get the format exactly the way that I want it. But the reality is, what I want from the CFP going forward is I want the regular season games, especially the conference games, to matter as much as they possibly can. And I think in this auto bid format, you really keep the earnest on them deep into the season instead of feeling relatively comfortable going into the month of November. If you're a Tennessee, let's say, and you already have that FCS game scheduled, you got Vandy at the end of the year that you feel pretty confident against, you're in a position where you can kind of put it into cruise control and still make a playoff, still be in the mix for all of this different type of stuff. That wouldn't really work the same way in the auto bid format, where you're not focused on where you rank in the national poll. You're focused on where you are in the SEC poll, or in the Big 10 poll, or in the Big 12 or ACC poll, and that's a hugely important thing. And that's going to be really, really fun to watch, and that's what I want from college football. I want conference races to matter. The other thing I want very, very badly for the CFP is just, I want to know what the criteria is. I want to know what happened to get this team to this place, because frankly there was a number of different scenarios last season, the last couple of seasons in the 4 team, wherever you want to go back to, where I just didn't fully understand what the reasoning was. And the reasoning at times has been very, very inconsistent, has been reasoning for one team, goes against them, and goes against another team in another scenario. There's a lot of back and forth in that committee room. And frankly, I don't trust that group of people to make the right decision. Plain and simple. I just don't. So I would like to know what a team has to do to make the CFP. As of right now, the only thing we know is win your conference. If you win your conference, you're absolutely in. Other than that, you don't really know what you have to do. You don't really know what's perfect. And even in the group of 5, even winning your conference doesn't guarantee you anything. So the reality is, I just want to know what it takes to win, to get into the CFP. If you're a 9-3, or let's say you're a 7-3 team going into the final 2 weeks of the season, you are 8th in your conference at that very moment. But these final 2 games are against teams that are in the top 6. you have 2 more games to play for a spot in the CFP. If you win those 2 games, you shoot yourself up into the top 6, you have a play-in game to get into that thing, and then you've won the games that you were meant to win. That's the most important part to me, because there are certain teams, even Ohio State, you could argue, in certain respects, lost a game that they should have won, and that in some cases for a CFP, maybe they had to have won to get into the CFP, and they didn't even have to worry. They weren't even remotely sweating. They were in the CFP. There was no question about that, regardless of what happened in that Michigan game. That won't be the case anymore. They will have lost that Michigan game and then have to turn around and play an Iowa team that has kind of been given a second life to get into the CFP. So for me, it comes down to 2 very simple things. I want the conference championship games to matter, I want the conference races to matter as much as they possibly can all the way into November, not just into the end of October or maybe a little bit into November. I want it to be to the very last weekend of the season. These teams are thinking about where they sit in their conference rankings and how that plays into this play-in weekend that we've talked about a little bit. And the other part is I want teams to have to win the games I want teams to have to win certain games to get into the CFP. Period. End of story. I don't want there to be a little bit of leeway going into the final week of the season. I don't want there to be, an Ohio State that gets to lose and still find themselves hosting a game in the CFP. I want them to have to earn it. And frankly, it's not to say that the teams that made it this past year did not deserve to be there. It's not to say that any team they got absolutely wrong. It's just to say I want to know what the criteria is. I want to know why certain teams are getting in. And frankly, the auto bid format's the best way to not make this an SEC and Big Ten invitational. I understand they get 4 auto bids compared to the 2 for the ACC and the Big 12, but the reality is in the at-large model, they're getting just about every single one of those 11 spots. Now, obviously, it's not going to be that aggressive, but you're going to see there's going to be a whole lot of spots of those at-large bids that are taken up by Notre Dame, the Big Ten, and the SEC. That's just the way it's going to be. So for me, I think the auto bid system is the best way to have as many different conferences represented, have the conference races mean the most going forward, and have the teams that walk into November at 9-1 or feel incredibly confident going into their final week are still looking over their shoulder. That's the most important thing to me. That's something that I very badly want, and I don't know if we're going to get it. I don't know if the Big Ten's going to win out. I know Tony Petitti started to actually be a little bit vocal when he talks about this and kind of the future that he wants for his conference. He very much wants the auto bid. I'm right there with him. I think it's the better thing for the sport. I think it's the better thing for the fans, and I think anytime you can take the power out of that committee's hands, I'm going to take that opportunity. I'll be totally honest with you. So overall, it'll be a really interesting thing to watch. I don't know if we're going to get an answer for this as before the season, but a lot of things are happening behind the scenes very, very quickly, and it'll be really interesting to see how all this kind of unfolds. The reality is, the way that I look at it, I think the 5+11 is more likely to happen just because the ACC and the Big 12 have to sell something to their presidents, have to be able to say, we're still a top-tier conference. The SEC is in favor, which already gives you half of the big-time, duo that we have in college sports right now. It feels mostly like we're going to get to a 5+11. I just think the auto bid model is a little bit better for the game. I think it's better for the regular season. I think it makes things a little bit more interesting in those conference races, and I think it helps the sport. So we'll see what happens. It'll be really interesting to follow, and frankly, a year ago, if you asked me, I would have said just put the best 16 teams in there. I don't want any conversation of auto bids or any of that. The reality is I don't trust the committee to do that. So I'm going to lean towards the auto bid model. If we redo the committee altogether, maybe we can have a different conversation next time around. But let's take our final break, and then we just got to give a general update, a full catch-up on all the things that we've missed the last little bit. Texas State is joining the Pac-12. Paul Feinbaum made quite a comment about Arch Manning and a number of other things right after this break, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just got into the CFP and I'm a little bit long-winded there. Apologies for that. There's the auto bid format. There's the at-large format. I'm in favor of the auto bid format. I cannot believe I'm saying that, frankly. A year ago, I would have called myself crazy, but at the end of the day, I do think it helps conference races. I think it just makes the sport more fun all the way throughout the season, and I got to be honest, for me, it's the regular season that matters the most. So I'd rather help the regular season than help the playoff. I'm going to lean towards that auto bid format. But let's get into a little bit of a summer catch up because we haven't talked in quite some time. I haven't been on these airwaves in a little bit, so we got a couple of things to catch up on, and it's been a busy last week, really. So there's a couple of things just from this last week that have gotten a little bit wild around college football. The biggest thing, the biggest one of the bunch is Texas State is joining the Pac-12 in 2026. They have informed the Sun Belt that they will be leaving. We'll have to pay about $5 million to get out of that conference, but they'd be more than happy to do so. They're joining all the other states. Remarkably, it is Boise, Fresno, Texas, San Diego, Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado State. All of those are states for the Big 12, for the Pac-12 going forward. The Pac-12 lives, weirdly enough, a conference that, if you ask me 18 months ago, if the Pac-12 was going to be around right now, I'd probably tell you no. I probably would have told you that Oregon State and Washington State are going to take whatever offer comes to them, probably from the Mountain West, and that thing is going to be dissolved. No longer the case. They found their way out of the wilderness now. It's pretty much the Mountain West. You add Boise State, Fresno State, San Diego State, Utah State, and Colorado State from that conference, so you're getting plenty of Mountain West flavor in there. I think you could be adding back those ACC teams that they lost a little bit ago because, frankly, I don't think Cal or Stanford leave if they're not in the situation where you just got to find a lifeboat at that point. So I don't think the Pac-12 is done adding teams. I think they will add back a couple of those teams, get to 10 teams in that conference. The reality is it's a very fun conference again. Cannot wait to watch this unfold. Now, wish these teams weren't moving around so much. Love the Sun Belt and the way it was. So hate that Texas State is leaving. Hate that the teams are leaving the Mountain West. But all things considered, the way we stand right now, I really like this conference. It's going to be a really, really fun conference. Now, it's not a power conference. I want to make that very clear. There's a lot of really good teams. And frankly, it could find its way up to that level. If I'm being totally honest, it's going to be kind of hard to get into those conversations with some of the other power conferences. But at the end of the day, they could find their way to that level. Coming in, it's going to be more of a group of six than back to the Power Five than anything else. But they might be the best group of six conference. I can tell you that. You know, the last 3 years, I believe, they would have had the top-ranked team in the group of five if you kind of take into account all of the different things. Boise State, obviously, last year. I believe it would have been Oregon State the last 2 years before that. So they would be firmly in the talks for that final, group of six spot for the CFP. Maybe they expand it to 2 spots for the group of six to make it a little bit more interesting. The Pac-12 is going to have a lot to say in the CFP going forward at the very least, probably from the group of six level. But overall, don't love talking about conference realignment just because it makes me a little bit sad. I love the Sun Belt the way it was, so don't love that Texas State is finding their way out. But at the end of the day, G.J. Kenny and the Bobcats are going to be a really interesting team pretty quickly in that conference. I think they're going to be a top 3 team when they walk in there. It's going to be really fun to see what they can do over the next couple of years and maybe help elevate that conference right back up to the Power 5. It's just probably going to take a little bit of time. And we got to talk about this. I kind of wish we didn't have to talk about this, but it's a huge, huge thing that came across my Twitter feed yesterday. And Paul Feinbaum had a take that I'm not even sure how he came to it. I'll be totally honest with you. The take essentially went that Arch Manning is the best quarterback that we have seen since Tim Tebow came onto the scene in 2006. That's just not true. For like 10 different reasons, it's not true. But we'll start with Tim Tebow's not the best quarterback since 2006. Now, if you were just to amend those words just a little bit, Arch Manning is the most anticipated quarterback since Tim Tebow. Absolutely, I'm there with you. Arch Manning could be the next Tim Tebow. I don't know if I'm quite there with you, but at the end of the day, I understand where you're coming from. Arch Manning could be one of the best players that we've seen at quarterback in the last couple of years. Right there with you. Definitely is on the table. Saying he objectively is the best quarterback we have seen since Tim Tebow, which isn't even the best quarterback we've seen since 2006, is just ridiculous for a number of different reasons. And it goes back to something I've said probably every single time that I've talked about Arch Manning on this show and on any other platform that I've been on. Arch Manning's not going to be good enough this year. I can almost promise you he is not going to be good enough this year. I can almost promise you in that Ohio State game, he will make a mistake that will make Paul Feinbaum tweet, "Why did everyone hype up this guy to be who he is?" I can almost promise you that is going to happen at some point in this year. Paul Feinbaum will be the guy that says, "Why was everyone hyping him up when he was hyping him up?" I can almost promise you that's going to happen. It's not to say Arch Manning is a bad player. I think he's going to be incredible. He has so many great things about him. He has so many incredible attributes. He has really good tape from a year ago that maybe wasn't against the greatest teams in the world, but you look at that Mississippi State game, he did some really special things, especially with his footwork, especially with his confidence in the pocket. He did some really great things in that game. I think he's going to be a great player. I think he's going to do incredible things. I think he's going to lead Texas to multiple CFPs because I don't think he's leaving after this year. I think he's going to be in the Heisman conversation very, very readily, maybe this year and next year. He's going to be a really good player. He is never going to be what people want him to be. He is never going to reach the level because the reality is for him to reach the level of the way that people are talking about him, he has to win the Heisman, they have to win the national championship, and they probably have to go undefeated. That is remarkably unfair for a first-year starter. Regardless of how long he sat, regardless of the name on the back of his jersey, regardless of all the attributes that I think are going to come out and he's going to be an incredible player, it is remarkably unfair what we're putting on this kid's shoulders. If anyone can handle it, it would be Arch Manning, and I think he will be fine. I'm not necessarily saying this is going to tank Arch Manning's season. It's just to say, let's just take a chill pill. Let's just calm down for 2 seconds. Let's allow this kid to play a game because I think there's going to be a moment or two in the first couple of weeks of that season where it just doesn't look quite right. It doesn't look all the way there because that's the way it should look. I think the same thing about Julian Sayin up there at Ohio State. I think there's going to be a couple of plays in those games where you say, man, these two kids are absolutely off the charts talented. And then there's going to be a couple of plays where you think, yeah, that's why they, are new starters. This is their very first game, and it's showing right about now. So Paul Feinbaum is just wrong for a number of different reasons, but did want to bring this up because Arch Manning has a lot on his shoulders already. He has Manning on the back of his jersey, which is plenty. He has all of the weight of the world of one of the biggest fan bases and biggest programs in the entire country on his shoulders. And the media is pumping him up to be someone that he's just probably not going to be this year. He's going to be a really good player. I don't think he's going to be absolutely impervious to any mistake, and frankly, I think that's kind of what he has to not be a quote-unquote disappointment this year. He's going to be fine. He's going to be a really good player. I think he's going to be a Heisman contender even this year. But it's going to take time. Can we just give the guy a little bit of time to get everything together? Because I think if we do that, he's going to be a really special player. But we'll move forward from that. A ridiculous take by Paul Feinbaum, but I get it. You got to get your clicks, and man, did he get his clicks. Moving forward to Wisconsin and Miami kind of going after each other in the courtroom, weirdly enough, Wisconsin has filed a lawsuit against Miami in the tampering realm. The way that they're describing it is they kind of interfered with a 2-year agreement that they had with Xavier Lucas. Xavier Lucas, if you don't know, very talented safety that was playing in Wisconsin last year, found his way over to Coral Gables this year, is going to probably be a starter for Miami right away. As long as this does not come into play, I don't think it will for his eligibility. But overall, very, very talented player. He found his way down to Miami, and Wisconsin got very mad very quickly. They claim that they met back in December. Xavier Lucas's agent fully denies those rumors that they met in December, and that Miami lured him away with more money. Now, the big thing here to remember, Xavier Lucas is not a part of this case. He is not named in this case. It is more just the case emanated from his recruitment, but he is not going to be in the courtroom. He is not going to be arguing. His agent isn't going to be in the courtroom. This is between Miami and Wisconsin plainly. So just something to keep in mind. He is not going to be a part of this, but the big thing here is Wisconsin just wants compensation. They want compensation for what they had invested into this kid and the money that in some cases they lost because they gave him money maybe, in December or in January, and then he found his way out through the portal. That's obviously something that they're going to fight. Now, Miami's not budging too much on this one right about now. We'll probably hear this one kind of come to fruition before the season starts. I don't know how much is going to come of this. Now, a big thing to keep in mind here is, let's say this doesn't hold up in court. Let's say Wisconsin gets absolutely nothing out of this. Miami's able to walk off scot-free. Maybe teams feel a little bit more comfortable breaking the rules around this house settlement going forward because this is kind of a precursor to a lot of the stuff that will unfold over the next little bit. I don't think this one will be, hit top news. I don't think it'll be crazy stuff, and I think Xavier Lucas will be more than fine. I think Wisconsin and Miami will move about their way here pretty shortly, but it is something to keep your eye out on, and we'll see if it has an impact on what the House settlement is and how enforceable it is going forward. And Jake Retzlaff. Let's talk about this here for a second. Jake Retzlaff has been something that's kind of been brewing over the past probably 2 months. When this first came out, he was accused of sexual assault earlier in this offseason during spring camp. He had not been with the team for the last little bit. And first, the lawsuit has officially been dropped by filing a joint motion. Tends to mean that there was an out-of-court settlement. I don't know the exact details here, but just something to keep in mind as we kind of go throughout this discourse. It does sound like an out-of-court settlement was met between these two parties. The thing to keep in mind here is Jake Retzlaff has essentially said that he's going to leave BYU. If he were to come back to BYU, he would have to face a 7-game suspension. I don't think that's changing anytime soon, even with the lawsuit being dropped and being kind of resolved. I don't think that's changing. So maybe there's a little bit of leeway there, but I don't see him being the starter for BYU. I see him transferring out, having to sit somewhere for this year, and then maybe playing in 2026. And that's something that will unfold over the next little bit. We'll see what happens there. In terms of what happens for BYU going forward, McKay Hillstead coming over from Utah State, Western Michigan transfer Trayson Bourget, who actually started his career at Arizona State, so has played in the Big 12, hasn't played in the Big 12, has played in a big conference before and understands what that's like. And then added Stanford transfer Bear Bachmeier, someone that I tend to think is going to win this job. He was added after spring practice, so that's something to keep in mind. Might not be quite there with the playbook the way that he needs to, but that tends to be the guy that I lean towards, at least in terms of talent, between these three guys to kind of take over for Jake Retzlaff. Regardless, it totally buries BYU for this upcoming season. I really like what BYU is. I think they have plenty of things that they can do really, really well, and they got plenty of really nice things coming in over the next couple of years. We'll get into that when we talk about recruiting next week, but overall, it's not going to be a great team. I frankly did not love this team going into this year with Jake Retzlaff because I think they got away with a lot of things last year, but especially without Jake Retzlaff there, I just don't think this is going to be a huge team in the Big 12. I think their Big 12 chances just went up in smoke, and that's what happens every now and then. But Jake Retzlaff, obviously, we'll see where he ends up landing. We'll see how all of this plays out, but he's probably done at BYU, and BYU, you got to find a new quarterback with about a month left before the season. They probably knew they had to find a new quarterback a couple of months ago, but at the end of the day, this is now official, and we'll see what happens here. One upsetting story to another. Harbaugh has officially been added to the Matt Weiss case that dates back a couple of years, actually. Dates back to the right before they played TCU in that in the playoff. There were allegations that came up around Matt Weiss, their co-offensive coordinator at the time with Sharon Moore, and he was someone he faces 14 counts of unauthorized access to computers, 10 counts of aggravated identity theft. Essentially what was happening here is he was hacking into the Wi-Fi of Michigan and going into sensitive information of students, of different athletes, a lot of really gross and disgusting things, frankly. And it sounds like Jim Harbaugh, Warren Manuel, Santa Ono, who is no longer the president at Michigan and tried to find his way down to Gainesville, got denied at the door, actually. But at the end of the day, those three people have been named among about 50 other staffers around Michigan, have been named in the lawsuit now. And essentially saying that they knew about these allegations prior to the TCU game, about 10 days prior is what it sounds like, and they did not do anything. They allowed him to coach that game. They fired him shortly after they lost that game, and they moved forward and hope that it would not hurt Michigan anymore. It might end up hurting Michigan, especially if Ward Manuel is a part of this. Obviously, Jim Harbaugh is no longer a part of the program. Santa Ono found his way out and might have been forced out just a little bit. But at the end of the day, if Ward Manuel is a big-time part, or is any part of this, this could hurt Michigan quite a bit. And frankly, if any of these three people, or if any of the people that are named in this suit knew about this stuff before that game and did not take action, knowing that all of this stuff was happening, they should never be allowed near college sports, or really sports, ever again, if I'm being totally honest. Now, I understand how the world works. I understand Jim Harbaugh is not getting fired if all of this stuff unfolds. He's not getting fired by the Chargers. I would argue he should be. But at the end of the day, a lot of stuff still to unfold here. This is all allegations at this very moment. I don't want to bury anyone by any means, but not enough people are talking about this one. I'll just be totally honest. A lot of people are tiptoeing around this issue because it is a very, very intense issue. It is one that is very, very upsetting in its nature. But the reality is, not talking about it is ridiculous to me. So we'll see what happens with Michigan. I don't think this affects Jerome Moore too aggressively now. It hypothetically could if Ward Manuel is involved in this and they have to find a new AD, and then a lot of different things could happen from there. But the reality is, this is just gross. More than anything else, it's just really, really gross. And you hope that none of them are involved. You hope none of them knew beforehand, but they're now in that suit, and we'll see what happens over the next little bit. We'll see if it does come back to hurt Michigan as a whole, not just Harbaugh or Ward Manuel or Santaono actually hurts the institution of Michigan. We'll see what happens. A lot of stuff around Michigan that I know Sharon Moore and plenty other people around that program just wish was not around, but here we are, and we'll see what happens with it. Definitely a very upsetting thing, and we'll see if there's any repercussions. Finally, on a little bit of a lighter note, Delaware and Missouri State have officially joined the FBS as of yesterday. We have the Delaware Blue Hens, we have Missouri State Bears. They are going to join Conference USA going into next year. Also, another move that now I have it. UMass is actually joining the MAC going into this upcoming year, so that's another movement in the conference realignment kind of world. But this is the big time one. Both FCS programs, very talented, had made the playoff down in the FCS levels at least multiple times in the past 5 years. Missouri State's a really good team with a lot of really fun players. It's Ryan Carty is the head coach for Delaware. Ryan Beard is the head coach for Missouri State. So a couple of Ryans finding their way over. Missouri State did not make things easy on themselves. I can tell you that. They get USC, SMU, and Marshall to open the year. I don't think they're winning any of those games. So I think they're going to start 0-3, but Jacob Clark's a really fun player at quarterback for them. Jamari Robertson at wide receiver. Two very interesting guys to watch, and frankly, they could lose those 3 games and then run the table in the Conference USA because that is a very doable conference. Now, I don't necessarily expect them to, but the reality is, let's just hope it goes a little bit smoother than it went for Kennesaw State last year with Brian Bohannon, who still shouldn't have been fired. But at the end of the day, let's just hope things go a little bit smoother for these two than it did for that one. But they are ineligible for the postseason, which is, again, an insane rule, ridiculous rule. But that's the reality right now. They could run into a little bit of a JMU problem. If one of these teams can put together a good year, I really like this Missouri State team. I'll look at the Conference USA a little bit closer as we get closer to the season, but I like this Missouri State team. I think they could be a really, really fun team and might just be able to do something special in that conference this upcoming year. But that's all I got for you. We got a million different things that have happened over the last little bit, but that's what I got for the time being. Didn't get into too much actual football as of right now. I promise, once we get into next week and getting into next week, Mondays and Fridays, all the way throughout July, we're going to do Mondays and Fridays, try to release this thing around 5 p.m. Eastern time on those Mondays and Fridays just to make it a little bit easier, make sure you guys can watch as readily as you want to, and then when we get into August, might be kicking it up to Monday, Wednesday, Friday, because there's a lot of stuff to get into. Took a little bit too long of a hiatus, but we're officially back. It is the month of July. We are 53 days from kickoff of this incredible college football season, and we get Farmageddon to get it started. So cannot wait for that. We're going to get some hot take blogs here coming soon. We're going to get some more niche videos on the site. We'll be playing around with a lot of different stuff. We will be heating things up very, very quickly here, posting blogs daily. Follow me on Twitter at Brzee_Thomas over on Twitter if you want to follow JACFB podcast, also over there on Twitter if you want to follow there. So a lot of stuff coming down the barrel here pretty soon, but thank you so much for tuning in. Please like, subscribe, comment, do all of that incredible stuff. Add any questions you have for me in the comments. I can work them into next week's shows, all that different type of stuff. Do all that, and I'll see you next time.